Good morning, everybody. It's Rita Smith, the #1 food fairy, and today I am going to give away my secret recipe for pulled pork. Easy pulled pork. Pulled pork takes time, there's no question about that, but you don't need to go through nearly as many steps as people might have you believe. I am going to use my own Fuego Spice rubbing sauce on the pork butt and pork shoulder before I sear it on the barbecue. I do want to give credit where credit is due, and that is my favorite Mexican cookbook, the Chevy and Rio Bravo Fresh Mex Cookbook, which I scored in their restaurant in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It was probably the best $17 I ever spent, and I think I've made every recipe in this book at least 3 times, as you can tell by the sticky notes, which are everywhere. I even grabbed a photocopy of their menu. So I would go through the menu and find out things that I wanted to make in combination, and all the recipes are here in the book. So I don't know too many really successful restaurants that have given away all their recipes, but I've used this one over and over again, and the Fuego Spice that I'm going to use for pulled pork is based on this. It's not exactly this. I always reduce the salt, and I generally reduce the spiciness. But the very first recipe I ever had for Fuego Spice came from the Chevy and Rio Bravo's book, and I cling to this book. I use it probably once a week. Okay, so pulled pork is made with the fatty cuts of pork. So what I've got here is a pork picnic shoulder. I paid $6.59 a kilo, which is $2.99 a pound. For this pork. I've seen it when it's not on special for as much as $17 or $18 a kilo, so that a roast this size costs like $20, $22, $24. I got this one for almost $12, $11.77 at $6.59 a kilo at Sobeys. It's a pretty good deal. I keep my eye open for them, and I grabbed 2 of them yesterday. So I've got both a blade roast and a shoulder roast. They are the fatty cuts of the meat. You can see how much fat there is in the pork. Early in my pulled pork career, I tried using leaner cuts, pork tenderloin, because I thought that would make for an improved recipe. Pork tenderloin is not meant for pulled pork. Pulled pork is meant for the fatty cuts of meat. You can chill the spicing broth afterward and skim some of the fat off if you want. But if you use a very lean pork for pulled pork, it will be dry and stringy and choke you as you're trying to eat it. Pulled pork is meant to be made with a fatty cut of meat. So I have a picnic shoulder and a blade cut here, a butt roast here. I'm going to momentarily, I'll rinse this and I'll show you how I season them with Fuego Spice. And then we're going to sear them on the barbecue and toss them into the oven for like about 5 hours. So stay tuned. I'll come back when I've rinsed the meat and show you how to spice it and sear it and then stick it in the oven. I'll check it out later at the end of today. Okay, I've rinsed the meat, and what I'm going to do is toss both pieces into a big giant bowl. I'm going to add Fuego Spice to the big giant bowl. This is paprika, onion powder, garlic powder, salt, chili powder. I'm sure if you go online you can find lots of recipes for Fuego Spice. It's actually kind of a rub. I'm going to rub the meat with it. I will tell you that when I first started making pulled pork, every recipe that I read told me to cut the pork into pieces and spice it, season it, sear it, and then put it in the oven. I've made it several times where I don't do any of that. I just season the whole entire roast and sear it on the barbecue. Then I put it in a cast iron pan in the oven. So that eliminates all that wrestling with the meat and the knife and the bones and the segments. It really is a lot of work. It adds like a half of an hour or so to the job. And I didn't find that it added anything at all to the flavor of the pulled pork. Like, not at all. Not to the flavor, not to the texture. So I couldn't figure out why I was doing that much work. It sort of seemed redundant. So since then, I've made probably a dozen recipes of pulled pork where all I do is sear the roast that has been rubbed with the Fuego Spice, and then I put it in the oven. And when it falls apart, it's very easy to break it down into smaller segments. And the outcome is the same, maybe even better, actually. So I'll wash my hands. We're going to head out to the barbecue. I'm going to let these sit for a second and soak up that rub. I can put a version of the recipe in the notes to this video. Or maybe I'll put them on the screen. I haven't decided that yet. But in any case, oregano, garlic, paprika, chili powder, salt. There's lots of recipes for fuego spice around. We're going to let that sit for just a minute, and then I'm going to go pop them out onto the barbecue. And we're going to sear them. I mean, we're going to blacken them. When you see them come off the barbecue, they will look like they were caught in a house fire, because kind of they were. That's the way you want it to go into the oven with the sauce you're going to put it in the oven with. And let it cook for about 4 or 5 hours at a very low temperature. Maybe even longer. Maybe 8. We'll see. Okay, I've got the barbecue cranked up as high as it's going to go. After I have it cleaned, it'll go higher. But I'm going to take our pork butt and pork shoulder that has been rolled in fuego spice. And I am going to let it really sear and crisp up. Here, let me just give you one more shot at that. This is probably going to take 8 or 10 minutes. I'm going to leave it here. I'll flip it. When I take it off, I hope it will be actually crispy and at least somewhat blackened. And that's just what we do before we put it in the oven in cast iron. So let's let the fuego spice rubbed pork butt and pork shoulder get seared in the barbecue, and then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so we're back at the barbecue. The outside of the meat has had a chance to crisp. I would like to see it actually char a little bit more. However, my barbecue is kind of sleepy after a winter of non-use, so it's not flaming to the same degree that I would like to see it. But in any case, I'm now going to take our giant chunks of pork shoulder and pork butt, and having seared the outside with fuego spice, I'm going to put it in the oven in a cast iron pan. And I'm taking off to 6 different appointments today, so I'm going to let this cook for about 5 hours, I think, at a low temperature, maybe 300, 275 or 300, in marinade. And that will be step 3 of pulled pork. So we have the rubbing step, we have the searing step, now we're going to have the marinating cooking step. And I will let you on to the rest of the process as we move along. Okay, so our pork butt, pork shoulder has been rubbed with fuego spice, seared on the barbecue. I am now going to do the most time-consuming part of the process, which is I'm going to stick both of these, oh good, nice and crispy, stick both of these in a cast iron pan, cast iron Dutch oven, and I will top them up with an aqua negra marinade, which is pineapple and soy sauce with fuego spice. I also put some ham stock in there. Oops, some big chunks of pineapple. The meat will start to fall apart as it is in the oven, and I can kind of stir it around a little bit and make sure that everything is well coated by the marinade and getting the seasoning and the tenderizing that it requires. I have got my oven on at 325. I might even actually turn it down to 300 because I'm going to be gone for a pretty long day today. And this will cook with the lid on the cast iron Dutch oven easily for 5 hours. It could be even longer than 5 hours, but for sure 5 hours. When I get home and I poke it, as you can see, I'll poke it now, it's pretty rubbery. When I get home and I poke it, it will fall apart. It will fall apart into what we consider to be pulled pork, and we'll address it at that time. We'll take out some of the bones, take out some of the big pieces of fat, and strip the pork into actual pulled pork, which is what it is by definition, and then flavor the sauce moving forward, maybe with some spicy barbecue sauce or whatever else we feel this needs. Because what it's in right now is basically a marinade. It's a soy and pineapple based marinade. It doesn't have the sweetness and the smoky flavor that people associate with pulled pork, but we'll make sure that it's addressed to that, or that it's adjusted for that later in the process. Right now we want it to be tender, and we want it to fall apart off the bones and away from the fat. So that's what's going to happen. In the next portion of this, I will put the lid to the Dutch oven on it and put it in the oven, and I'll be back in about 5 hours. Hi everybody. So we're back with pulled pork. This actually, after I rubbed it with the Fuego spice, seared it on the barbecue, put it in the oven with a soy pineapple marinade. I let it cook. Oh my God, it's almost 7:30 at night now. I think this was in the oven for about 8 hours, actually. 7 or 8 hours for sure. At a very low temperature, 275. And so what I'm going to do now, this is the next step in pulled pork. It is a multi-step process, but it got very nicely crisped and seared on the barbecue, and caramelized in the long, slow cooking process. So what I'm going to do now, this adds a day to the process, but it kind of really is worth it at the end of the day. And this is not a fast meal. This is not anything that's made in a hurry. Is I'm going to pull as much of the meat that I can see and that I can grip with any kind of piece of equipment, tongs or a scoop or however I can get the meat out of the pan, and put it in my pasta cooker just simply to strain it, because what I want to do is actually chill the remaining aqua negra marinade to let the fat come to the top. There's a lot of fat in pulled pork, and I do want to use the marinade as part of the sauce that will accompany the pulled pork, or that it will be cooked in a second time. I don't want to waste it, but I do want to get some of the fat off of it if I can. So I am going to pull everything out of the pan and chill what's left over so that I can skim the fat off of the top. And I'll just let it sit overnight, and I'll deal with it again tomorrow. By that time, the fat, I can already see it floating to the top now. I'm going to try to put it in a tall, deep container so that the fat will rise to the top, and I'll just skim it off. I'll pull the bones and the chunks of visible fat out of the meat itself. And everything that is left in terms of drippings, I will boil it like crazy. Add some barbecue sauce to it. This is after I've pulled the solid fat off of it, after it's been chilled. And then when you mix the meat back into that sauce and pull the pork apart in the shredding process that you're used to seeing pulled pork actually come out like shredded stringy pork, the pulling process, the sauce that is remaining will have had the fat skimmed off and be delicious in the sauce, and you at least have removed 1/4 inch of pork fat, that's visible fat floating on the top of the sauce. So that is what is going to happen in the next step of the process. So the next time you see the sauce, I'll be pulling the fat off the top of it. I can see the fat floating right there. Like you don't want that. If you've got time to avoid it, why wouldn't you? Nobody's going to be eating this tonight or tomorrow. As a matter of fact, it's probably going to go in the freezer. So I'm going to take an extra day to let this cool and to pull the fat off of it so that I can use the remaining slather as part of the sauce with a nice spicy barbecue sauce to make pulled pork. So that's what will happen in the next step of this long but rewarding process. Okay, here we are just about 24 hours after we started our pulled pork recipe. And now I'm going to address the marinade, which we'll now call a sauce, almost like a slather. It's so thick. And it's mixed in now with all the pork juices because they cooked in the oven yesterday for 7 hours. When I got home, I took the pork out and set it aside. We'll work with that in a second. And I took all the juices, drippings, marinade, reserve liquid in the pan and chilled it. So you can see there's quite a thick layer of fat on there, and we don't want that necessarily to go into our recipe. So I'm going to pop that off now, and given that it is nicely chilled in the fridge overnight, it's pretty easy to just, oh, look at all that. Okay, it's not all the fat. There is fat in pulled pork. There's no way around that. You use a fatty cut of meat. You don't add any fat to it, but you do use a fatty cuts of meat, because otherwise it's not pulled pork. You can't use lean pork for pulled pork, which is probably bad news for everybody who's diet conscious who loves pulled pork. But you can do this. You can chill the reserve liquids and pry off as much of the visible fat as it is possible to do. And that is a lot of fat. It's totally worth doing. If you just forged right ahead and made the recipe without chilling the liquid and skimming off the fat, you'd be eating tablespoons and tablespoons and tablespoons of fat that it's not necessary to eat. But we definitely do want the flavor. We definitely do want the flavor that comes from the reserve liquids, including all the pork drippings. So there, we've got just about all the fat off of there that we can get. We're going to mix this up with a little bit of ham stock and some barbecue sauce and actually pull the pork in the liquid, and then we'll talk about the next step when we get over there. So there you go. As fat-free as I can make it. Drippings from pulled pork, very concentrated flavor. The marinade is there, the pork drippings are there, the fuego spice is there. So let's leave that for a moment and get over to the stove where I will be warming up the liquid, pulling the pork, and then we'll figure out whether or not we want to heat it to serve right away or freeze it for an event in the future. Okay, so on top of my stove I have my cast iron Dutch oven. This is what we slow cooked the pulled pork in yesterday as the third step of the recipe. I've got simmering inside of the cast iron pan just a little bit of ham stock. You could use chicken stock, you could use water. To be truthful, the reserve drippings from the pulled pork pan are so intensely flavorful and perhaps even a little salty because of all this fuego spice that you could just probably get away with using water. You might also want to use pineapple juice, which is tenderizing and flavorful. I think some people put orange in pulled pork or in carnitas, which is a very similar recipe. I don't like the flavor of orange, so I don't use that. But I am putting in the reserve drippings. I'm going to stir those around. If I felt it needed more liquid, certainly I could use water. You don't have to have anything fancy to just kind of liquefy, thin out the slather that came from the pan. So we're going to stir that up a bit. There's a big chunk of pineapple in there from our aqua negra dressing, which is a soy pineapple based dressing. I've used a whole bunch of different marinades, and I actually find that Chevy and Rio Bravo's soy pineapple recipe gives you the best flavor and the best tenderizing properties for the meat. So I've kind of stuck to that one. Now I'm going to add quite a lot of barbecue sauce. Maybe even, at the end of the day, I might have even added a whole bottle. So this is just your basic original hickory smoked barbecue sauce. If there's a particular flavor that you are in love with, if you have a gourmet barbecue sauce that you love, by all means, use that. I find there's so much else going on in a pan of pulled pork that it's a waste of expensive barbecue sauce. Unless somebody loves a recipe particularly, I would just use something reasonably priced and reasonably good. So there now we have thinned out the drippings. We've added some stock. Oh, it smells really good. It smells very barbecue. And now I'm going to add the meat. So you'll remember that yesterday we rubbed the pork roast, the shoulder and the blade, pork butt and pork shoulder. We rubbed it with fuego spice. We seared it on the barbecue. We covered it in marinade and put it in the oven. It actually ended up being in the oven for 7 hours. It was in at 300 or 325 for an hour or so But then since I was leaving the house, I turned it down to 275, and it actually stayed in the oven for a total of about 7 hours. So 275 is a good temperature because it was in there for a long time. Very tender when I took it out. And now I'm going to add our meat to the slather and the barbecue sauce and the stock. Okay, I'm going to try to get this out without splashing up and burning myself. So this is where you're going to see the pull to pulled pork. Well, look at here. I'm pulling it right now. Here I am pulling it. I'm pulling pork. But I'm going to pull it a little bit finer, more finely with a knife. See, look at all the fat that even is still on the bottom. I didn't, as hard as I tried to remove the visible fat, there's still visible fat in my pulled pork recipe. I'll just pull that off if I can with my fingers. Okay. There we go. Get rid of that. Okay, so now we can actually commence with the pulling of the pork, which is to say that I'm going to take a big fork and I'm going to, like, literally pull. I'm going to pull this meat until it shreds into, you know, the fairly lengthy, stringy pieces of pork that you are used to seeing in a pulled pork recipe. So this is what it means to actually pull pork. I'm pulling it. I'm shredding it. I'm reducing it into little fine strips. Okay. I'm going to need some extra tools in a moment because I don't think this one fork is going to cut it. I think my other fork is over in the sink. But we're going to shred this until it begins to look like just a fine mash of long, stringy pieces of pork. And they're not stringy in the sense that they're dry, they're just stringy in the sense that they're long. That's what you're used to seeing on your burgers, on your slider buns, on your burritos. Okay, let me see if I've got something a little handier to work on with that with. Nope, not imminently. I'll take a break and find something a little bit sturdier. Okay, I'm going to hope that this will be helpful. It's a bit of a longer handled fork. And I'm going to continue this process all the way through the pan until it is, the meat and the sauce are pretty evenly distributed. That's going to take a moment. But as you can see, as the meat heats up and the fat melts, it's going to become a little bit easier to work with. There we go. That's starting to look like pulled pork. It's certainly starting to smell like pulled pork. Oh my God, is that ever going to be good? And I know exactly the party we're going to be eating at too. It's going to be Zarinka's birthday party on Friday, May the 2nd. So one of the things about pulled pork is that it's awesomely, all of the work is done well in advance. There's no making pulled pork for company the same day you eat it. There is no point. It's the ultimate make-ahead meal. And if you buy some slider buns or some burritos, tortillas, soft tortillas that you can roll up like a taco or a carnita or a burrito, all your work is done a week ahead of time because we're going to freeze this for next weekend. Oh, there's a big chunk. Let's get that shredded up. That's that big chunk on the sandwich. Here's another big chunk. We're going to shred that up. So I'm going to keep doing this for a couple of minutes, and then when we come back, we'll figure out what to do with this next. So here we are at the end of our process. Remember, we had a pork butt and a pork shoulder. We rubbed them with Fuego spice. We seared them on the barbecue. We put them into a cast iron pan. You could use any kind, but I like cast iron. We put them into a pan with a marinade. I used an aqua negra sauce, which is soy sauce and pineapple, but you may have a favorite marinade of your own. We cooked them. I actually ended up cooking them for a total of 7 hours, mostly at 275 degrees. A long, slow cooking process in the cast iron pan. We removed the meat from the pan. We chilled the remaining sauce drippings so that we could skim the fat off. Then we put the meat and the remaining drippings slather in the pan with some barbecue sauce and some liquid, stock or water. return the pork to the pan, shredded it, so that makes it pulled pork. And now this is ready to either eat right now, heat one more time in the oven if you really want to caramelize it, put it into a crock pot, or freeze it in portions or larger portions for company later to serve on slider buns or soft flour tortillas. And you've got burritos, carnitas, slider buns, pulled pork in as many variations. You could put it on pizza, you could put it in omelets, you could do anything you want with it. It's really delicious and your family will thank you for it. This is something you do well ahead of time. You're not doing this the day company's coming. You're doing this well ahead of time because it takes at least 24 hours, maybe 48, depending on how long you get to spend on it. Totally worth it and very popular right now. Be confident in the kitchen, try new things, enjoy yourself, and this is Rita Smith signing off.